Welcome back, you filthy exiles. So, if you guys have been following my streams, I've been doing a dry run for my league starter, which is going to be the Shield Crush Jugg. Now, a few things. So, what this build will cover off on is leveling from Act 1 through to 10 through to T3 mapping. And then obviously beyond that point will be moving into, I guess, the endgame tree that I've provided as well in the initial video that I put up around my league starter and whatnot. Now, a few disclaimer points with this build, just off the cuff. So I've had a lot of questions around should you play Boneshatter or RF or whatever for early delve. If you are considering playing Boneshatter or RF, I would recommend playing that. This build is a little bit harder to get started at league start, but that being said, I've ironed it out so it's as smooth as it can be for a melee skill, because just bearing in mind, melee is still not in a fantastic place. So what I've done with the trees is tried best to cater for worst possible case scenarios. What you can see here on screen, obviously I've got an Emperor's Vigilance. A lot of gear, pretty much all the gear outside the shield, and I would replace this with a Lionized Remorse, to be honest with you, because it's a relatively cheap item according to the POB or the poe.ninja market from last league as well. Basically, Thrill Steel is going to be in the build because everything here less the shield dropped for me in the game as I was doing the level test. So nothing here was like, except for the shield, was artificially obtained. Now, the shield's not in the path of buildings of any of the leveling guides, so just to take that edge off, I've replaced the Act 10 through to T3 POB with Lionized Remorse and Devotos, and whatever really cheap like uniques that you'll realistically be able to get from the, maybe 10 chaos that will drop or whatever early on. Now, just something else, as you go through, you do need to actively gear up. You can't just rely on the skill to do everything for you. And so you'll see in the tree, I've also provided a full comprehensive notes section to the entire tree, which I'll just pull up on screen, basically explaining what you need to do in each act. And then what you need to do, the uniques to target once you get out of the campaign. You will notice a little gruffness from maybe Act 4 and 5. It picks up in Act 6, 7, 8, and 9. Act 10 will be a bit shady because the skill needs to catch up and you require some gearing to get it there, or early gearing. And then in early maps, once you've got your resistances capped and your defense starts to build, the build actually gets really good and starts to pop off. So for people who want instant gratification, I'm just going to straight up say this is not going to be the build for you. If you're looking at like Poison SRS or something like that, and that's what you want, and you just want to have one click, everything dies in front of you sort of league starter, then play that build. Don't touch this build. Right, straight up front, just being straight down the line. There is a few uniques that you will need, but they're all relatively inexpensive at the start of league, though some people will argue otherwise. And I consider a league start build over the course of the first like 3, 4, 5 days. And I'll be doing progress guides of my level up as well. This isn't taking into account any of the significant changes to the item mastery systems. It's taking into account the new POBs. I actually underleveled to 62 in Act 10, and that's a problem for this build. You need to be 65 by Act 10. So I've also got a section here in Act 9. If you're not scaled up to 65 by the end of Act 9, then go back to the Blood Aqueducts and just level up in Blood Aqueducts, right, until you get to Act 10. Total time to clear the campaign without any gear or any drops, honestly, I had no drops while I was playing this that assisted me, was about 10 to 11 hours worst case. And the other thing to bear in mind, you will need to pick up every single skill point that you level up with, and the Pantheons as well, because it being the first character out, and I've provided the Pantheons and everything that you'll need, you really do, every skill point does matter with this build. That being said, I've done the best that I can to make this as easy to play through as possible. Now, you could sub out for Spectral Shield Throw. I haven't done a tree for that because that's not what I tested, but if you want to look up, for example, Valenya has a Spectral Shield Throw build that she plays on the Raider. You could apply the same skill setups as that, or you could apply, the British Exile has a Bleed Shield Crush build, I'm pretty sure. You could also apply the preface of that to scale Bleed on the Jugg early, and that might give you the early damage that you need to push across the line. Where this stands, I was pretty happy with the damage. Some people were saying, oh, it's a Z DPS on the stream or whatever. It does take a few hits sometimes to kill things when you're leveling up with absolutely scuffed gear, like gear from Act 1, for example. I was running around with a sword from like Act 3 and stuff like that. That's just the reality of a League starter. Anyway, that's my disclaimer. So if you're looking at RF, Boneshatter, SRS, whatever, play those builds over this one. This one's more like if you want to play something different, you don't want to play the same old, same old. This build, however, its DPS scales significantly once you get into early to yellow tier maps, and once you farm up enough to get that little bit of currency you need to get the few uniques for the build that become pretty available in the first few days, then this build's damage goes through the roof, as well as scaling Unbreakable with armor stacking means you can get into Delve much sooner and crank Delve after you finish your maps in the first week. So that's all the disclaimers out of the way. Let's get into the video and let's talk through this guide. Okay, so just before we get into this, keynotes on this build, right? Just to overview, I guess, the disclaimer that I just said and everything else, and this will all be written in the description on the video with all the POBs and everything. This is a slower scaling build, so if you're looking at Boneshatter because it's faster, and honestly, Boneshatter has the same issues defensively as what this build has, but, you know, it's melee, then go with Boneshatter, don't go with this build. If you think this might give you a bad league start, or if you're impatient, go with Boneshatter is what I'd say. And that's me just straight down the line candid. Campaign completion time was about 11 to 12 hours. Honestly, like, I'm not a speedrunner, and this is my league starter, so I consider that perfectly fine. I like to chill out on the first day, and you'll get drops and whatever. By the time you get to maps, you'll be progressing. And to be honest with you, this will scale up pretty quickly because it uses things like Cull and whatever. If you've had a look at the main build guide, then it gets pretty good in map clear. And end game for map clear is that if that's what you intend to use it for, then Aureus and things like that will be obtainable through farming currency and Delve. As I said, if you're considering Boneshatter or RF, play those builds. Like, they are just straight up better builds, early on at least. But late game, this build is where it shines. It's a heavy DPS build in the late game. It's a little slower than other builds in leveling, but it ramps up, and you know, this build works. It's defensive, it hits hard. It didn't have any issues taking down any of the end act bosses. You just sit on the boss and crack the boss and it smashes through. So I really didn't see any real major issues or anything like that. Like, it was competent completely all the way through, just not as fast as what other builds would do. And that's perfectly okay as far as I'm concerned. You always need to keep upgrading your shield, and if you can get a Lion's Eye Remorse early up, then that's going to be a good shield to get moving into your mapping. But you want something with like 1,000 armor over, and you'll notice, like, even the items throughout, you'll notice it's like really bad I had really bad shields, and it does significantly hinder the DPS on this build without having a high armor shield. And then you'll also notice once you do get the Emperor's Vigilance, your damage just starts skyrocketing through the roof, because it's quite a powerful shield. And beyond that point, focus on capping resistances. So one thing I ran into in Act 10 were RF enemies. I didn't have my fire res capped, and also in mapping, resistance capping is quite important, and we're going to be using Unbreakable as well. And one of the other things that really makes this build more defensive, funnily enough, is Unstoppable. And so I would say, like, if you get it to this point, depending on the way you feel, either Unstoppable or Unbreakable. Unbreakable, if you've got higher armor, is going to provide a lot more defensiveness for your resistances, as long as you have your resistances capped. If your resistances are not capped, you're going to have a bad day. As you can see, like, early on with crap gear, it gets to like 50,400 effective hit pool for like T1 to T3 mapping. So it starts to get pretty bloody tanky early on, where other builds, that's like their end game. Like glass cannon builds like TR and whatever, that's their end game level of tankiness. So this build does this in the like by Act 10 to T1 to 3 maps. So it's not a bad build at all defensively, and that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to smash Crystal Kings at the end of the day. Mana sustain. There's a couple of ways you could do this. You could switch out a gem, any of the skill gems for life tap, but I actually chose to reserve clarity using arrogance against my health pool, and basically arrogance enhances the effect of that skill as well. So you could do that with with life regeneration, vitality, so you get more vitality and more life regen, but it gets on average 700 life regen per second anyway, because it's pretty bloody it's pretty regenerative. But if you are struggling with mana early on, then arrogance I think becomes available at level 28 or 32. And then basically you can, and I think I've got it listed here, and we'll talk about this in this guide anyway, you just need to put a clarity gem attached to arrogance, and Bob's your uncle, you're good to go. And that's basically the main keynotes that you need to know about this build. And I'm keeping this completely candid and honest. Like, this isn't the easiest league starter out there, but it's a fun league starter, and once it pops off in maps, it's a hell of a lot of fun with Delve and everything else. And it's a Juggernaut, and I just love playing Jugg. But as I said, I'll be committing to this build. I know it works. It worked in 3.19, and it can only be more powerful with the changes now, because Shield Crushers have been touched in the last 2 leagues. So it's still a very good build. If anything, it will have a higher endpoint DPS, and that being said, leveling will have access to the shield item trees as well, and that's most likely going up with the crucible mods, and that's most likely going to give you a lot more defense, which is going to give you a lot more power. And on top of that, this build's going to hopefully be able to handle the crucible mobs and be able to tackle the harder content earlier on, because it is a little tankier, be it it'll take a little longer to kill. It should be completely competent. So anyway, let's get into the act by act. I'm going to roll some gameplay and then basically put up on screen what everything looks like, and then yeah, we'll go from there. And then if you've got any questions, put the comments well, obviously post up the comments below, and I'll try and field as many questions you've got as possible. But that's pretty much where it's at. And now you've got all the information, let's talk about how you level this up. Okay, so for Act 1, you're going to level using Ground Slam. From level 1, you're going to equip a 2-handed axe or hammer. You'll want to have a 3-link setup of Ground Slam, Life Tap, and Chance to Bleed. Chance to Bleed is just going to make it a lot easier for that early leveling, because using Dot is usually a pretty easy way to get early leveling to really work in your favor. You'll also need to equip Ancestral Protector for a bit of a buffed attack speed. The Precision Aura is going to be needed, Blood and Sand, Vitality, and don't forget to run Enduring Cry. Now, the overall progression speed of this, while not the fastest, is pretty decent, and you'll get through Act 1 in no time. Okay, so by the end of Act 2, you're going to pretty much just be continuing using Ground Slam. The progression's pretty moderate at this stage, like there's no real bottoming out or anything like that. Any uniques you can upgrade that you have dropped for you, you're going to want to equip. Just continue to progress your weapons forwards. Make sure you're looking for a better shield, always for a better shield. The other thing you want to do is make sure you have War Banner attached as well now, and that's going to give you an early buff to damage, but we're not going to run anything like Herald of Purity or anything like that, just because we'll have enough auras attached to the build as it stands. But basically, Act 2, you just continue to progress Ground Slam as per written in the POB notes. Okay, Act 3 is where stuff starts to get a little more interesting. So by the end of Act 3, you'll still be progressing Ground Slam at this stage up until about level 28. Once you get to level 28, you can make the change to Spectral Shield Throw, Life Tap, and Chance to Bleed. Now, you can choose to continue to use Ground Slam, because in Act 4 we'll be getting Multi-Strike. And what I actually did was switch to Shield Crush as soon as I got to Multi-Strike. But if you want to switch to Spectral Shield Throw and level from this point, you can do that and progress forwards with that. That's going to make it a lot easier to at least clear Act 4 moving forwards from the end of Act 3. Now, the other thing too is you want to switch out War Banner for Dread Banner. I think you get this at about level 24 to level 28, and start increasing your Impale against enemies. The other thing that you'll be doing is you'll be able to ascend as soon as you complete all your trials, your initial 6 trials. So what you can see on screen in the background is I was actually able to ascend with the gearing that I had by the end of Act 3 with just Ground Slam. So it was strong enough that it could take down a Zaro. There were no issues with getting my initial ascendancy, which funnily enough can be a problem for weaker builds, but not for this build, because initially it was so tanky leveling up through the first 3 acts. Okay, so once you get to the end of Act 4, you get access to Multi-Strike. Or actually, you get access to Multi-Strike throughout the act from one of the earlier quests that you complete. I would recommend you make the choice here as to whether or not you want to switch to Shield Crush, or you could stick to Spectral Shield Throw, or you could also switch to Boneshatter and level up with Boneshatter. It just means you'll need to get Untiring when you ascend. And I should have noted, when you ascend your first ascendancy, you're going to want to make it your accuracy ascendancy, which is undeniable. And this is going to give you a significant increase to the amount of attack speed early on that you get, which is actually going to give you a huge quality of life boost on this build. So basically, you can do that, get multi-strike, then you can start using Shield Crush. Now, assuming that you had Shield Crush attached into your character earlier on, you just need to go back to Act 1, you can get a pre-level gem. Now, I progressed at this stage with Shield Crush, and on a 4-link setup, Impale, melee physical damage, and multi-strike. So initially I tried Fortify, and I decided melee physical damage was a much better and much higher level of DPS that you could get out of the build earlier on. And so that's going to supplement the increased defense that you would get from Fortify earlier on. So it's just trading out a bit of defense earlier for a bit more offense, which I actually preferred in the end. Now, the other question then is, well, how do you sustain that from a mana standpoint? And what I simply did was have Clarity and then attach this with, or support this with Arrogance, and reserve a little bit of my health pool moving into the next act. And so basically from this point onwards, my damage started to ramp up until about Act 7, where it drops. It's relatively slow, sort of moving through Act 4 into Act 5 at this stage. But fundamentally, it starts to ramp up closer to Act 7 at this point, because your Shield Crush and increasing your shield armor tends to scale this build further and further. And obviously with increased attack speed, it makes it a hell of a lot easier as well. But that's basically what I did for Act 4 to push it forwards. Okay, so getting to the end of Act 5 now, you'll add in Assassin's Mark, Mark on hit and life tap, and that's in preparation for the use of Marked for Death, which is actually on the skill tree that you'll see in the leveling POB that we'll be moving to, which allows you to start integrating Cull into the setup. Now, also on that, you'll use the Mark Mastery, which allows you to generate frenzy charges, so 10% chance to generate frenzy charges when you hit a marked enemy, and this is going to increase your attack speed further and make it easier to wipe packs moving into Act 6 and 7, which is why I was saying in the earlier part in the Act 4 run through that your damage starts to increase and your clear speed starts to increase on this basis as well, because you start running Cull, and you can cull a lot of the rarer enemies, which takes a lot of the load off the build, being not as good at clearing as what other builds are. So that also makes it a lot easier to fight bosses. You'll generate frenzy charges on fighting bosses, and so the only enigma that's still left in this build that I need to work through from League Start will be replacing out the Blue Nightmare for something that can generate power charges moving forwards. But that's basically what you need to do by the end of Act 5, and you'll see the POB in the description for this as well. Okay, so no significant changes in Act 6. What I'd probably say is this is where you want to start to balance out your resistances as best possible. Some of the hurdles I ran into were dealing with things like fire damage, ignites, righteous fire enemies and whatnot, as well as the Brine King was a bit shady as well, just while my damage was sort of trying to catch up. So you will notice Act 6 will be a little slower, though generally a lot of the builds I play, by the time they get to Act 6, this is where like the first bump up in power in the game is sort of felt beyond the earlier acts, and so you just need to adapt your build, add defense, find a better shield, and I use Shield Crush to level up through this. I gotta say I didn't really run into any issues throughout Act 6. I did die a few times. I think by the end of the 10 acts I died like 20 times. So if you were playing hardcore, or if you were playing like SSF, you'd probably set up the tree a little better, a little more defensive, take a little more time to kill things, but I was in the interest of pushing through as quickly as I could. And that being said, also don't forget to pick up all of your additional quest skill points as well, because you will need them to progress forwards moving into Act 7. But the tree that's provided was about where I got to at the end of Act 6, and then the ramp up in damage starts to come in Act 7. Okay, so for Act 7, this is where we start to make some defensive changes. So we introduce Determination in the build because we start to take some mana reservation efficiency nodes in the tree. You'll also want to ascend at this stage if you can to unflinching, being your second ascendancy, because you should have caught up at this stage, and having determination will up your defense enough that you can take on the second Azaro throughout the campaign. And you'll also look to getting call to arms, and then mapping this to your move button, because this will allow you to then run Enduring Cry on the setup constantly. And I would also recommend potentially at this stage setting up your Molten Shell to be on a cast when damage taken setup, because this is going to make a hell of a lot easier to sort of sustain. So when you take damage, it'll be up when you need it, and that's going to allow you to have Enduring Cry up a lot more as well, which will make it easier to progress through the Act 7 campaign. I really didn't struggle with Act 7. I think I died a couple times to the chaos damage to the last Act boss, the big-ass spider mofo. But outside of that, this is when the speed starts to ramp up to about Act 9. It starts to get pretty comfortable playing the build. And until Act 10 is when we start to run into a few issues with our resistances not being capped and whatnot at that point. Okay, so for Act 8, it's just continuing to progress the tree, continuing to look for a better shield, continuing to balance your resistances and your gear. Make sure you're consistently upgrading your gear. Don't let it stagnate, otherwise your character's defense and its damage is going to drop back. For the sword, so the way that if you're running Shield Crush or Spectral Shield Throw at a level instead of Boneshatter, then basically you'll need to look for a sword that provides global attributes like global critical strike multi, or increased accuracy, overall accuracy. That's going to increase your attack speed and your damage, and or anything that procs bleed, or anything that has increased impale effect, which you're usually going to find on one-handed axes. Okay, so by the end of Act 9, basically where you want to be, there's no real adjustments aside from finding better shields, continuing to progress the tree as per the trees provided. The other thing that you want to also make sure is by the end of Act 9, get to level 65. If you're not level 65, go back and farm the Blood Aqueducts until you're at least like level 64, 65. Where I made the mistake of moving into Act 10 being under level 66, which Act 10 is a level 66 zone, is I was just benign as far as my ability to defensively mitigate enemy damage. So that's where I sort of ran into some issues with Act 10. So I'd say just go back, rerun Blood Aqueducts a few times, get to level 65. This will also give you some drops. Now this does slow your overall progression run down, but it does make the progression into endgame mapping a lot smoother because you're a much higher level. And it means that you'll be able to keep up with labs and everything. Your damage will scale up a little earlier as well. And it'll just be a lot more accommodating to the build earlier on, as opposed to struggling all the way through Act 10, which is what I did. And I died probably like 15 times in Act 10 or something like that. And that's my fault. So, you know, if anyone watched that on stream, I did not do so well. And I did get frustrated. And what people might end up doing by Act 10, if you do exactly that, is you will basically go, oh, this build's not going to work, rah, rah, rah. Well, in reality, by the time you get to like Act 10, you'll be looking to get those early uniques. What I'd also say is any item, any chaos that you've had drop, go onto the market and look for Lionized Remorse, look for Seething Furies if you can get them, look for an early Dawn Strider, Devoto's Devolution, anything that will prop up your damage early. Also items like Prismatic Eclipse earlier on, which are usable at level 53, would be good for you. Devoto's is level 67, so you'll still be 2 levels off being able to use that. Lionized Remorse is a level 70 item, so any shield that you could get, a rare shield that has over 1,000 armor, is going to give you an advantage. And then also Dawn Strider, if you can get that too, switch to 1 totem and use that as Ancestral War Chief, and that'll significantly buff your totems up as well, and your ability to inflict damage on enemies, especially bosses. And the other thing is you might want to look for like some leveling rings, like a Ridgewald's ring or something like that, with any spare casts that you have drops, because that's going to give you a huge advantage in the leveling process as well. Okay, so by the time you clear Act 10, as noted, you want your level to be around 66 to 67, maybe 68, right? So you, if need be, just farm some areas, like even in the feeding trough, rerun the feeding trough a few times because it's a relatively easy area to continuously farm. Um, but otherwise, by the time you finish Act 10, you pretty much want to be focusing on maxing out your resistances, and any chaos drops that you've had drop, aim for trying to get your early Brass Dome, Emperor's Vigilance, and Replica Dreamfeather. Now, Replica Dreamfeather might take a couple days to come up on the market. I'm not too sure what the effect of people not doing endless heists will be. Whether or not you can do endless heists anymore or whatnot, I don't think you can anymore with the changes, with the removal of the book from heist that lets you regress level. But anyway, beyond that, there'll potentially be plenty of replica Dream Feathers on the market, I hope. If not, look for your Seething Fury, your Emperor's Vigilance earlier on, or, for example, your Lionized Remorse and Prismatic Eclipse Blade, and Devoto's Devolution and Dawn Striders, you should be able to get by the end of Act 10. This is going to get you ready for mapping, and then the other focus is to make sure that your resistances are capped. Now, Chaos Res, it's going to be frustrating. You're not going to be able to cap that straight away, so use an Amethyst Flask to get around that in the time being. But then basically focus on building an amalgam of your gear to reach that endpoint. If you can get an early Magnate for cheap as well, I'd recommend getting that, but they tend to be a little expensive because it is a fantastic item. So any other similar belt or something of that nature that props up your resistances is going to be the preference. Now, that's basically going to be a target by the end of Act 10, and then moving into early mapping. And pretty much that's the tree that I've put up to cover off on that. Now, you are going to run into some potential struggles beyond Act 10 into that early mapping, where you might get completely ripped apart in the first couple of maps that you run. That's within the level of sort of expectation with this build, but once you introduce a couple of those cheap uniques into the build, then it'll start to take off. Like any build, if you just go into maps expecting the skill to do everything for you, then it's just not going to work. And I suspect there will be people that will do that, and they'll get frustrated, and they'll go, this build is shit, my league starts ruined, rah rah rah. That tends to always be people that do that. All you need to do is stick with gear up, and the build will continue to progress, and you'll overcome that in no time with just a little bit of grinding initially in those early maps. But it won't stop you from progressing early maps in any way, shape, or form. At least I didn't find that it stopped me. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this leveling guide. I've got pretty much everything you need to focus on in the POB. Now, beyond mapping and whatnot, or beyond getting through the axe and into early mapping, I've also provided sources of early spikes of power, being Emperor's Vigilance, Replica Dreamfeather, and Brass Dome. Now, some people will struggle by the time they get to this point, and that's generally going to be people who haven't taken the time to understand the build and want a boilerplate template where they can just click a button and mindlessly play a build. This is not going to be the build for you if that's what you're thinking. So if you're going to do that, play Righteous Fire. I would say just play Righteous Fire. If you want a build that's going to scale up natively where you don't really need to do anything or think about it or whatever, Righteous Fire is actually going to be your best option in that case. This build does require a bit of tinkering once you get to mapping to balance it out, but once you get that early mapping balance and those few early uniques, and for anyone who says Lionized Remorse is expensive, it was like 3 to 5C at the start of last league. Devoto's is similar, and Prismatic Eclipse is like a 2-3C item. And same with Dawn Striders, because no one really uses it for outside of these builds. And this is not like a meta build by any shape or form. So I don't suspect there'll be huge sums of players playing this build, because it's not going to be like get to Ubers or whatever. Now, for anyone who asked me that fucking question, can this do Ubers? If you throw 2 mirrors into anything, you can do Ubers, basically. That's what I'm going to say. It's not going to do Ubers once you leave the axe. If anything, it just is going to steadily progress you through maps. You will need to scale the build up through maps. So if you just leave it like this and expect to get T16s like this, it's not going to work. I think I've tried to cover off on as many sort of corners that people will try and angle to say the build doesn't work at this stage. If you have a bad time on league start, honestly, like just re-roll the build and change it to Boneshatter. And that should be pretty easy because the tree's not very dissimilar. A few regret orbs later, switch it to Boneshatter. If you don't like the build, it is what it is. It's an acquired taste build, but I'm not going to take any responsibility for anybody who has a bad league start. I've pretty much done the DD here, and I'll be playing this myself on league start because I also know where you get to pretty quickly after you progress it, and the items to get it cracking are not expensive. By the end of the first week, I'd anticipate maybe 10 div, which for the average player, if you follow my delve guides, everything is completely achievable. That will get you to a pretty good like midpoint with a few mil DPS on the Jugg. Like if you get it up to like 2 to 5 mil DPS in the first week, that's going to be a really, really strong early league starter build. And then basically you'll be able to farm, delve, and do whatever you want to do and whatnot. But anyway, hopefully this build, this leveling guide gives you an idea of how to level this up. You can approach it any way you want to approach it. This is just the way that I experienced it in running a dry run over the last week. There were ups and downs. It's not the best league starter in the world. It doesn't just cheese its way through the game. But once you get to that point where you get those few unique items and you scale it up, you get it onto a 5-link, then it's actually an extremely fun build to play. And once you scale it up into the end game build, it's a god tier build to take down Crystal Kings and everything else in between. Anyway, if you like this video, drop me a like, drop me a sub. Be very wary of playing this build if you're not comfortable with it or whatever, or your expectations are up here. Drop the bar down a little bit and just play the build and have some fun. But anyway, I'll see you guys on the league start morning before, about an hour before. Anyway, stay filthy and have a good one.